The crying stopped before I reached the wagon, and that silence was worse than any sound I have heard in 40 years of open country. I want to put that down first plain, because everything else I am about to tell you bends around that one moment, the moment the crying quit. A hungry baby cries. That is the whole arrangement of things, the way a body announces it still intends to live. When the crying goes thin and then goes flat and then goes to nothing at all, a man who knows the sound knows exactly what it means, and I knew it, and I put my heels to a horse that had already run itself half to ruin. My name does not matter much to the telling. Folks around the Picos called me Amos, or called me the fence man, or called me nothing and just nodded, which suited me fine. I ran cattle when there were cattle to run and mended wire when there were not, and in between I kept a little book in my saddlebag where I wrote things down. Not a diary exactly, more a habit. My mother could read, and she taught me before the fever took her, and writing things kept her close somehow, like she was still checking my letters over my shoulder. I mention the book because you'll find I come back to it. A man who writes things down is a man who cannot quite let a thing go, and that is both my failing and, I have come to think, the reason 3 lives turned the way they turned. It was the tale of a bad August. The kind where the sky goes white at the edges and the grass turns to paper and the whole world smells like a struck match that never caught. I was riding the low country between the river and the broken hills, checking on nothing in particular, when I came over a rise and saw the wagon down in the wash. It was tipped, one wheel gone entirely and the axle dug into the sand like a broken finger. A mule stood off to the side, still hitched, its head down, too spent even to graze. And near the wagon, a shape on the ground that my mind refused for one whole second to make into a woman. But it was a woman, and she was not moving. I will tell you what I did, and I will not dress it up. I froze. For the space of 3 or 4 heartbeats I sat my horse at the top of that rise and did nothing at all, because there is a coward in every man, and mine chooses the exact worst moments to speak up, whispering that whatever is down there is already finished, and there's no use spending yourself on the finished. I am not proud of those heartbeats. I have thought about them often since. But then the crying started thin, from inside the wagon, a sound like a kitten more than a child, and the coward shut his mouth, and I went down that slope so fast I nearly went over the horse's neck. The woman was alive, barely. She had a gash along her hairline black with dried blood, and her lips had cracked white with thirst, and when I got her head up and put my canteen to her mouth she drank like a creature and then coughed most of it back up. Her eyes came open and found me, and I watched her decide in that first raw instant whether I was a rescue or a new kind of trouble. Out there a stranger could be either. She was right to weigh it. But whatever she saw in my face let her spend the last of her strength on one word. And the word was not water, and it was not help. The word was baby. I have carried a great many things across broken ground. Calves and fence posts, and once a man with his leg gone wrong. I had never in my life carried anything that made my hands shake the way they shook when I climbed into that ruined wagon and found the child. It was small. God, it was small, new enough that it hadn't yet grown into its own face, wrapped in a shawl that had once been good cloth and was now just dust and sweat. Its little chest went up and down too fast, that quick shallow breathing of a thing running out of what it needs. When I lifted it the head lolled and I got a hand under it the way you do, and it turned its mouth toward my thumb, rooting, hunting for milk that a man's dirty thumb was never going to give it. And there it was, the whole disaster laid out clean. The mother could barely hold her own head up, let alone nurse. There was no other soul for 40 miles that I knew of, and a baby that knew cannot eat what you and I eat. It cannot chew a strip of jerky or gum a biscuit. It needs the one thing that the entire hard country around us did not contain: milk. Not cow's milk from a can, there was no can, and cow's milk straight would likely finish what the thirst had started. It needed a woman. It needed a mother. And the only mother within reach was dying in the sand with her eyes rolling back. I did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said the child would be dead by morning. I am going to slow down here, because this is the part I have never told straight to a living person. And if I'm going to tell it now, I mean to tell it right. I sat there in the tipped wagon with that baby against my chest, and I felt something I did not have a name for at the time. I have a name for it now. It was grief arriving early. It was my whole body getting ready to lose a thing I had known for the length of about 4 minutes. And underneath the grief, quiet and ugly, was that coward again, doing his arithmetic, telling me the merciful thing might be to make the mother comfortable and let the child go easy and not drag two doomed strangers across a desert to die slower. I want you to understand I considered it. I am not a saint, and I will not have you thinking I am. I considered leaving them soft and easy right where they lay. And the only reason I did not, the honest only reason, is that the baby, at that exact moment, wrapped its whole hand around one of my fingers. That is all, a reflex. Bobby's grab, it means nothing. Any doctor will tell you the grip is just old animal wiring left over from when we lived in trees. It meant nothing. It meant everything. Before I moved them, I did one more thing, and it is a small thing, but I have never forgotten it. I searched the wagon. Not for money, I want that understood, but because a wagon tells you who a person is, and I needed to know who I was carrying. There was a Bible with a name written in the front in a woman's careful hand, Ellen, and under it a man's name crossed out hard enough to tear the paper, which told its own quiet story. There was a tin of buttons, a child's spoon, too new to have been used, a folded square of yellow cloth that would have been a curtain if there had ever been a window to hang it in, and I understood, holding it, that this woman had been carrying her curtains into an empty country, which is a thing only a person who still believes in a future does. I put the yellow cloth in my saddlebag. I could not have told you why. I know why now. A body in that much trouble needs someone to keep hold of the small proof that she had once been planning to be happy. I got them both up on my horse. The mother I lashed on in front of me with my own belt run through the saddle and around her waist so she wouldn't slide, and the baby I put inside my shirt against my skin because I did not know what else to do with it, and some animal part of me knew that warmth was a kind of food when there was no other food to be had. The mule I cut loose. I have wondered since if that was cruel, leaving it, but it followed us away, and then it didn't, and I have made my peace with the things I couldn't carry. The ride is a smear in my memory. Heat comes off that country in the late day like it comes off a stove lid, in waves you can see, and I rode into it with a woman's dead weight against my chest and a baby's heartbeat ticking against my own too fast, and I talked. I talked the whole way. Nonsense, mostly, the kind of low, steady talk you give a spooked animal, but I have thought since that I was not talking to them. I was talking to myself to keep the coward quiet, to keep my own nerve from bolting. I told the baby about the little book in my saddlebag. I told the woman that she was going to be all right, which I did not believe, which is a particular kind of lie a person tells not to deceive, but to keep a promise he intends to spend himself trying to make true. My voice cracked more than once. Nobody was there to hear it crack but a mule that fell behind and a hawk turning slow overhead, waiting the way they wait, patient as arithmetic. Now, where does a man go in the emptiest quarter of Texas, when what he needs is a nursing mother, and there is no town, no doctor, no neighbor, no God's own thing but dust and heat for a day's ride in every direction? He goes to the one place he has spent his whole life being taught to fear. I turned my horse toward the broken hills, toward the Apache. I had best explain that, because if you are a certain kind of person raised on a certain kind of story, you have just decided you know how this goes, and you do not know how this goes. In those years the people, that is what they call themselves. The word we butchered into Apache means enemy in some other tribe's tongue, which tells you everything about who did the nomming. The people were being hunted. Hunted like the antelope, driven off their water, promised land and moved off it, promised peace and shot under the flag of it. I had ridden with men who bragged about things I will not write down. I had also once been pulled half dead from a flash flood by two Apache boys who could have very reasonably let the river have me, and instead spent an afternoon, they did not owe me getting a white man breathing again. So I did not carry the hate that a lot of my neighbors carried. But I will not pretend I rode toward those hills brave. I rode toward them terrified, with a dying white woman lashed to my saddle and a dying baby against my heart, betting all three of our lives on a thin, cracked hope that somewhere in those hills was a woman with milk and a heart that had not been turned to flint by everything my own people had done to her own. It was, when you said it out plainly, an insane thing to do. I have never done a saner thing in my life. The light was going amber, and long by the time I found the smoke. Just a thread of it, careful, the kind of fire that means people who do not want to be found. I got down off my horse a good way out, and I did the only thing I could think of that might keep us all alive. I set the baby on the ground in front of me, in the open, in plain sight, and I stood over it with my hands held wide and empty, and I waited. You do not ride armed and sudden into a camp of people who have every reason to shoot you. You come slow, and you come with your hands showing, and you put the most defenseless thing you have out where they can see it, and you let them understand you have come as a beggar and not a threat. I did not plan this. I want to be clear. Some older, wiser part of me did it while the thinking part of me stood by useless and afraid. They came out of the rocks like the rocks had decided to move. I never saw them approach. One moment there was scrub and shadow, and the next there were 4 men with rifles, and one of them was close enough that I could see he had a scar that pulled one eye half shut. Nobody spoke. The baby, blessedly, chose that moment to cry, that same thin kitten sound, and I saw every one of those men flick their eyes toward it and then back to me, and something shifted. A sound like that gets under a person's ribs, no matter what language they dream in. There is a thing that happens to a man's fear when he has already given up the idea of saving himself. It goes quiet. I had ridden in terrified for my own skin, and somewhere on that ride, without deciding to, I had traded that terror for a bigger and calmer one, the fear of failing the 2 lives I'd tied to my own. When the men came out of the rocks, I found I was not afraid of the rifles. I was afraid only that they would say no and turn and go back into the hills and leave me standing there in the dusk holding a child I could not feed. That is the mercy in a big enough fear. It burns the small ones off. I pointed to the baby. I pointed to the woman on my horse. I made the only sign I knew for hunger, my hand to my mouth, and then I did a thing I could not have explained if you'd asked me. I cradled my empty arms and rocked them, and I let my face show the fear and the grief without trying to hide it, because I had nothing left to bargain with but the truth of how badly I needed help. The scarred man looked at me for a long, long time. Then he turned and called back toward the rocks, one short word, and a woman came down out of the failing light with a child of her own riding her hip, and I understood as she came closer, from the way she held herself, from a certain fullness, that she was a mother still nursing. She looked at me the way you'd look at a rattlesnake that had knocked on your door and asked politely for a cup of sugar. Then she looked at the baby on the ground, and her whole face changed. I have seen a lot of hard weather and a lot of hard faces. I had never seen a face change the way hers changed, going in one breath from wariness to a grief that mirrored my own, because a nursing mother knows that thin cry the way I knew it, knows it in her body, in the parts of her that had made milk for her own. She said something sharp to the men. She crossed to the baby and she knelt and she lifted it, and I will remember this until they put me under. She did not hesitate. She did not weigh whether this pale foreign child was worth her milk. She did not think about the men who looked like me and what they had done to her people. She opened her clothing and she put that starving white baby to her breast, right there in the dust with 4 armed men and one terrified stranger standing over her, and the baby latched and began, at last, greedily to feed. And she wept while it fed, silently. The tears just came and ran and she let them. I did too. I am not ashamed to write it. I stood in the last light of a killing August day and I cried like the child, because I had ridden toward these people expecting to beg for one life, and instead a woman I could not speak to had just handed me back all 3, the babies, and the mothers, who could not have survived losing it, and mine, which had been coming apart at the seams for reasons I did not yet fully understand. That was the first evening. It should have been the whole story. A rescue, a kindness, a stranger's mercy, and then everyone goes their separate ways richer for it. But mercy, I have learned, is never the end of a story. It is only the door. What came after that door, the days in that camp, the thing the scarred man asked me to help him carry, the choice the white mother made when she woke and understood whose milk was keeping her son alive, that is where the real story lives, and it is harder than anything I have told you yet. Let me get us through that first night first. They let me stay. That alone should tell you something about who these people actually were, as opposed to who I'd been told they were my whole life. They had every reason to drive me off or worse. Instead, the scarred man, his name, I would learn, sounded like Dahana, though I never trusted my own mouth to say it right, gestured me toward the fire with the flat of his hand. The universal grammar of sit. You are permitted to be here. And I sat, and someone put a gourd of water in my hands, and I drank and did not cough it up. And for the first time since I'd come over that rise and seen the tipped wagon, I let myself believe the night might not end in graves. The nursing woman was called something I heard as Nady. She kept the baby with her by the fire, and she tended it with a competence that made my throat tight, cleaning it, warming it, making the small sounds women make at infants in every tongue that ever was. Her own child, a fat, serious little thing maybe a year old, watched all this with the frank, offended interest of a firstborn watching its mother love a stranger. Now and then Nady would look over at the white woman laid out on a blanket at the edge of the light, and her face would do something complicated. I could not read all of it. Some of it I think was pity. Some of it, I came to believe later, was a harder and more honest thing. The knowledge that this pale sleeping woman belonged to the same people who had made Nady's life a running wound, and that Nady was going to save her child anyway, and that there was no reconciling those two facts, only carrying them both. They cleaned the mother's wound. An old man with hands like roots pressed something green and bitter-smelling to the gash on her scalp and bound it with a strip of hide, and he tipped water and then a broth into her a little at a time through the night, patient as rainfall, and slowly, I watched it happen. The gray went out of her skin and something like a living color came back. She did not wake fully that night, but she stopped dying. There is a difference, and I sat up watching for it, and somewhere in the coldest part of the dark I saw her cross from the one to the other, and I put my face in my hands. I took out my little book. I could barely see to write, but I have the page still, and it says, in a hand shaking so bad I can hardly read it, they did not have to. That is all it says. They did not have to. I did not have the words yet for the rest of what I meant, and maybe there are no words for it, but I have spent years now trying to find them, and the closest I have come is this. I had spent my whole life being handed one story about who was the savage and who was the civilized, and in a single evening, a scar-eyed man and a nursing mother had taken that story out of my hands and torn it up and handed me back the pieces and said, without a word of my language, here, you'll want to write this one down different. I did. This is me. All these years later, writing it down different. The fire burned low. The baby slept against Nady with its belly full for the first time in who knew how long, and its breathing had gone deep and slow, and even that good heavy sleep of a thing that has been told, in the only language a newborn understands, that it is going to be allowed to live. The mother slept and did not die. The men kept their watch. And I sat there, a white stranger in an Apache camp under more stars than any city man has ever been permitted to see. And I felt the day's terror finally drain out of me and leave behind it something I had not felt in longer than I could remember. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I did not yet know what it would cost. I did not know that the woman on the blanket would wake in 2 days' time, and that her waking would put a question to all of us that milk alone could not answer. I did not know that Dahana would, before this was over, ask me to carry a thing on my conscience that I carry to this hour. I did not know that the fat, serious baby on Nadi's hip and the pale, starving baby at her breast would grow up in a world doing everything in its power to make sure they never learned they had once, for a few weeks in a bad August, shared the same mother. I knew none of that yet. That first night, all I knew was the sound. The crying had stopped out in the wash, and it had meant death. And now the crying had started again, a full, indignant, healthy squall in the deep of the night. The sound of a baby who has decided it is hungry again and by God intends to say so. And Nady shushed it and shifted it and gave it what it needed. And I lay by the embers and listened to that furious little noise fill up the dark. It is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. I have heard music since, and church bells, and a woman I loved say my name. None of it touched the sound of that baby crying to be fed in the middle of an Apache camp, alive, alive, alive against everything, because a woman with every reason in the world to turn away had looked down into the dust and decided that a hungry child is a hungry child, and that some things are simpler and older and truer than the wars we build on top of them. I did not sleep. I lay there and I listened to her feed him and I waited for the morning, and I was afraid of the morning, the way you are afraid of anything you can feel coming that you cannot yet see. Somewhere in the small hours, the old man with the root hands came and sat by me. He did not speak my language and I did not speak his, so we did the thing that people have always done in the dark when they cannot trade words. We traded a look, and then we traded silence, and it was a full silence, the kind that says more than most talking. He pointed at the white baby sleeping against Nady, and then he pointed at his own chest over the heart, and then he made a small motion with his open hand, opening it further like a thing let go. I did not understand it that night. I have turned it over 1,000 times since, and I think what he was telling me was this: that the child was already, in some way that had nothing to do with blood or nation, one of theirs now, that milk makes a kinship older than any treaty, and that having fed him they could no more unfeed him than they could take back the dawn. I think he was warning me. I think he was telling me that the simple rescue I imagined I had ridden in for was already becoming something far more tangled, and that when the white woman woke, there would be a reckoning between what she believed and what her son's own body had already accepted. I did not understand. I smiled at him like a fool, and he patted my knee like a patient grandfather and went back to his watch. The morning came anyway, they always do. And with it came the woman's first clear waking, and the first hard question, and the beginning of everything the milk had only made possible. She woke on the second morning, and the first thing she did was try to kill the woman who was saving her son. I need to tell it in order or it won't make sense, and it barely makes sense even in order, so bear with me. I have set this scene down in my little book more times than any other, crossing out and starting over, because it is the hinge the whole thing turns on, and I have never once gotten it to sit still on the page. Grief and gratitude and terror, all arriving in the same body at the same instant, will not hold still. But I'll try. The morning came up gray and then gold. Ellen, I knew her name by then, from the Bible, though she did not yet know I knew it, had slept through a day and 2 nights, surfacing only to be given broth and water by the old root-handed man, sinking again before her eyes could hold a thought. On that second morning she surfaced and did not sink. I was watching because I had been watching for it, and I saw the difference the moment it happened. Her eyes opened, and they were her own eyes, present, aware, doing the frantic arithmetic that a mother's mind does before it has even finished waking. Where is my? And then she saw. She saw a woman she did not know, brown-skinned, dark-haired, unmistakably Apache, sitting a few feet away in the early light with a baby at her breast, and the baby was hers. I have tried to imagine it from inside her. A woman who has crossed half a hard continent, who has buried God knows what along the way, who has been raised on the same poison stories I was raised on and worse, who lay down dying with her infant son, and has now woken to find that son in the arms of everything she has been taught her whole life to fear, feeding at the breast of it. I do not think Ellen woke into the world. I think she woke into a nightmare that happened to be true, and she did the thing a cornered animal does. She lunged. She had no strength. That is the only reason nobody was hurt. She got maybe a foot off her blanket, one hand out like a claw, a sound coming out of her that I will not try to spell, before her wrecked body folded and put her back down in the dirt. But the intent was there, plain and total. She meant to take her child back from the arms holding it, and she did not care what it cost. Nadie did not flinch. That is the detail I keep returning to. Nadie did not pull the baby back protectively, did not recoil, did not answer the white woman's terror with her own. She simply turned so that Ellen could see the child's face, see that he was feeding, see that he was pink and full and alive where 2 days before he had been gray and dying, and she held still, and she let Ellen look. She let the truth do the work. And I watched the fight go out of Ellen not all at once but in stages, the way water goes out of a wrung cloth, as her eyes took in what her ears had been too panicked to register, that her son was not being harmed, that her son was being saved, that the thing she had woken up ready to die fighting was, in plain fact, the only reason her son had a heartbeat at all. She began to cry, not softly. It came up out of her in great ugly heaves, the crying of a person whose entire framework for understanding the world has just been kicked out from under her. And I did the only thing I could think to do, which was to cross to her and get down in the dirt beside her and say, over and over low, "He's alive. Ma'am, Ellen, he's alive. She saved him, he's alive." She grabbed my shirt. She looked at me with a face coming apart. And she said the thing that I think is the truest and most terrible sentence I have ever heard a human being say, because it held her whole ruin in it at once. She said, "I would rather he was dead than that." I want to stop here and be fair to her, because it would be easy to write Ellen as the villain of this, and she was not a villain. She was a woman who had been handed a monstrous story about other people since before she could walk, and had never once had a reason to doubt it, and was now being asked, while half dead, while shattered, while unmoored, to throw that whole story away in a single morning on the strength of an act of kindness. She had no box to put it in. Most of us are never tested that hard even with our full strength and a full night's sleep. She failed the first test. I have failed easier ones. I did not think less of her for the sentence, but I have never forgotten it, and I do not think Nadie ever forgot it either, though Nadie could not have understood the words. Or, and this is the thing, maybe she did understand, not the words, but a mother watching another mother look at a saved child and choose death over rescue. I think that crosses every border there is. I looked at Nadie in that moment, and her face had gone very still and very old, and she looked back at me, and I did not have to translate anything. She had understood the shape of it, and she kept feeding the baby anyway. That is the part I cannot get over. She heard, in whatever way she heard it, that this woman would rather the child die than be touched by her, and she kept her son alive anyway. She did not withdraw the milk to punish the ingratitude. She was better than that. She was better than that in a way that shames me to write about, because I do not know that I would have been. The baby finished feeding and slept, and in the quiet after, something in Ellen broke the rest of the way, and out of the wreckage a different woman started, very slowly, to climb. That is really what part 2 is about, if it's about any one thing. It is about the days it took Ellen to climb out of the story she'd been given and into the story that was actually happening in front of her. It did not take an hour. It took nearly 2 weeks, and it was not a straight climb, and there were mornings she slid all the way back down. But it happened. I watched it happen. And I have never seen anything harder or more worth the watching, because a body healing from a wound is a common thing, and a soul healing from a lie is not. Let me tell you how it went, because the how is everything. The first days she would not let Nadie near her, though she could not stop Nadie from feeding the child, and the arithmetic of that was its own daily torture. She needed this woman, hated needing her, hated more that the need was for her own son's life and not her own, so that she could not even have the dignity of refusing. 3 times a day, and through the nights, the baby cried to be fed, and 3 times a day. And through the nights, Ellen had to watch the person she'd woken up trying to kill do the one thing Ellen's own body could not yet do. She lay on her blanket and she watched, and her jaw worked and her hands knotted in the cloth, and the shame and the gratitude and the old buried hate fought it out in her face while her son's throat worked, swallowing, swallowing, growing fat and loud and alive on the kindness she could not make herself accept. I sat with her a lot in those days. I was the only one she could talk to, and talk she did, low and fierce, saying things I think she needed to say out loud to hear how they sounded. She said they must want something. She said this was a trick, that they were fattening the child for some purpose she couldn't yet see. She said her husband, the crossed-out name, had told her what these people did, and she recited a catalog of horrors that I had heard my whole life and that I now knew, from a week of eyes open watching, to be mostly the reverse of the truth, the accusations of the guilty painted onto the innocent. I did not argue with her. You cannot argue a person out of a story that has held their whole world together. You can only outlast it. So I listened. And now and then when she'd wound down, I'd tell her something small and true. I'd say, that old man dressed your head wound 4 times a night for 2 nights and never took a thing for it. I'd say, they cut their own rations to make you broth. I'd say, the woman you'd have killed has a son of her own and feeds yours first. Every time, watch her. She feeds yours first. And Ellen would go quiet, and her eyes would move to Nadie and the 2 Bobbies, and I could see the story cracking, and I could see how much it hurt her to feel it crack, because a person's story is load-bearing, and when it goes the whole structure shifts and groans, and you do not know yet what will be left standing. The turn, when it came through the children. Nadie's own boy, the fat, serious one, whose name I never fully caught but which I heard as something like a soft double note. So in my book I just wrote him down as the boy had decided, with the total conviction of the very young, that the white baby was his personal property. His to inspect, his to be affronted by, his to, eventually and grudgingly, adore. On about the 5th day I watched the boy toddle over to where the white baby lay kicking on a blanket in the shade, and after a long censorious examination, offer it a small smooth stone he had evidently been treasuring. A gift. The gravest gift a person that age can give, a favorite thing, handed over. The white baby did what Bobbies do and tried to eat it, and the boy took it back, offended, and then thought better of it and gave it again. And this went on, and it was the funniest and most ordinary thing in the world. 2 Bobbies negotiating over a rock, and I heard a sound I had not heard from Ellen in the whole time I'd known her. She laughed. It surprised her more than it surprised me. It got out before she could stop it, a short startled bark of a laugh, and then her hand came up to her mouth like she'd said something obscene, because to laugh was to admit that something was funny, and for something to be funny here was to admit that these were people, ordinary people, with a serious fat baby who hoarded rocks. And once you have admitted that a people are people, the whole terrible story you were told about them cannot hold its shape anymore. I saw her feel it go. I saw her fight it and lose. And she put her face down into her blanket and cried again, but it was a different crying now, and I got up and walked a distance away and let her have it in private, because some things a person has to come apart over alone. After that it went faster, not fast but faster. I should tell you about the ordinary things, because the ordinary things are where the healing actually lived. The dramatic moments, the lunge, the laugh, the apology, those are the ones you remember, but they are not the ones that did the work. The work was done in 1,000 small, unremarkable hours. It was done when Nadie, without being asked, brought Ellen a gourd of the same broth the old man made, and set it by her hand, and walked away before Ellen could refuse it, so that refusing became more trouble than drinking. It was done when one of the younger women showed Ellen, with gestures and patience, how to fold a cloth so it wouldn't chafe the baby, and Ellen, who a week before would sooner have died, leaned in to watch and learn, because a mother's want to do right by her child will, given time, burn through almost any hatred she was handed. It was done in the way the whole camp simply absorbed these two helpless strangers into the daily round of feeding and tending, and watching the sky, not with speeches about brotherhood, of which there were none, but with the wordless practical mercy of people who have themselves known what it is to be at the end of everything and dependent on the goodness of others. I wrote a lot in my book those days. I have the pages. One of them says only, "Kindness is not a feeling here. It is a chore they do." That was the thing that undid every story I'd been told. I had imagined, if I had imagined savages being kind at all, that it would be some grand exception, a single shining act. Instead, it was constant and unremarkable and tired, the way real kindness always is, somebody getting up in the cold again to tend a wound that wasn't theirs, somebody splitting a short ration a fifth way, somebody carrying water they were too tired to carry. Grand mercy is easy to admire and easy to doubt. It was the tired, chore-like, day-after-day mercy that finally convinced Ellen, and finally convinced me, because you cannot fake that. Nobody keeps faking that for 2 weeks for a stranger who wanted them dead. She let Nady hand her the baby, the first time on the 7th day. Nady brought the child over after feeding him, full and drowsy, and instead of laying him on the blanket she held him out directly to Ellen, offering the mother her own son, an offering with a whole world of meaning folded into it. And Ellen looked at the child and looked at the hands holding him, brown hands, the hands she had been raised to fear, and she reached out and took her son from those hands. And for just a moment the two women's fingers were touching under the weight of the sleeping baby. And neither of them pulled away. I had to leave the camp for a minute. I told myself I needed to check the horse. There is a limit to how much of that kind of thing a man can watch without needing to go stand by himself in the scrub and get his own face under control. By the end of the first week, Ellen's own strength had begun, in the slow way of it, to come back, and with it a possibility I had not let myself think about, that her milk might return. It happens sometimes when the body has been starved and then fed back up. A nursing mother's supply, driven off by shock and thirst and injury, can come back if the child is put to her. The old root-handed man seemed to know this. He communicated it to Nady somehow, and Nady communicated it to Ellen through me and through gestures. And here is where you see how far Ellen had climbed, because a week before she would have refused any suggestion these people made on principle, and now she nodded. And she let them help her try. And here is the part that undid me. Nady did not have to help with this. Every hour of milk that Ellen's own body took back was an hour of the bond between Nady and the white baby loosening. She was, in the plainest terms, working to make herself unnecessary, to give the child back fully to a woman who had woken up wanting her dead. And she did it without a flicker of anything but tenderness. She showed Ellen how to hold him, how to wake her own body up, and when in the second week the thing actually took, when Ellen's own milk came in and her own son fed at her own breast for the first time, I watched Nady sit back and watch it with an expression I have spent years trying to name. It was not relief. It was not triumph. It was, I think, the particular grief of a generous act completed, the ache you feel when you have given a thing away on purpose, and it is truly gone now, and you are glad and you are hollow both at once. She had loved that baby. You do not feed a starving child back to life at your own breast and not love it. And now she was handing the love, whole, to another woman and keeping only the loss. Ellen wept while her son fed from her, and she looked for the first time across the little space at Nady directly, and she said, knowing Nady could not understand the words, saying them anyway because they had to be said out loud into the world, she said, "I'm sorry. Oh God, I'm so sorry." And Nady, who could not have understood a syllable of it, understood all of it, and she reached over and she put her hand on Ellen's foot, the only part of her she could reach, and she left it there. And the two mothers sat like that in the dust with a child feeding between their two claims on him, and I stood at the edge of the firelight, and I did not check the horse this time. I just let it run down my face and did not wipe it. I thought that was the reckoning. I thought Ellen crossing from that first terrible sentence to that apology was the hard thing this story had to offer, and that what remained was only the gentle work of getting her strong enough to travel and finding her somewhere safe to go. I was wrong. The hard thing had not come yet. The hard thing came the night Dahana, the scarred man, took me away from the fire and asked me, in the pieced-together sign and gesture language we had built between us over those 2 weeks, to help him carry something. And what he asked me to carry was not a thing at all. It was a choice, and it was going to cost somebody, and I was the one who was going to have to decide who. I'll tell you the shape of it, and then I'll stop, because I have never been able to write past this part in one sitting. The camp was being hunted. I had half understood this from the start, the careful fire, the way the men slept in shifts, the tension that lived under even the tenderest moments. But that night Dahana made me understand it fully. There were soldiers moving through the country, not far, days, maybe less. The camp would have to break and run soon into higher and harder ground, and they would have to move fast and light, and a white woman and 2 infants were neither fast nor light. Ellen was not yet strong enough to ride hard. The bobbies could not be carried at speed for days without milk and shelter. If the camp took them along, it would slow, and a slowed camp in that country in that year was a dead camp. And if the camp did not take them along, if it left Ellen and the white baby behind for the soldiers to find, which would in one sense be the safest thing for Ellen, delivered back to her own people, then Nadie's own child, the boy, the rock hoarder, would still have to be carried at speed through the hunt, and the milk that was keeping 2 bobbies alive was one woman's milk, and one woman running for her life through the hills cannot easily nurse 2. Do you see it? Do you see the terrible arithmetic of it? Somebody's child was going to be harder to keep alive because of the choice that got made. And Dahana, this is why I will love that scarred man until I die. Dahana was not asking me to make the choice for my own convenience or his people's. He was laying the whole thing out in front of me, honestly, in the dark, mother to mother and man to man across everything that was supposed to divide us, and he was asking me a single question that I have never fully recovered from being asked. He was asking me what was right. I have to tell you one more thing about those 2 weeks before I tell you my answer, because it is the thing that made the answer so heavy. In the 2nd week, Ellen told me the baby's name. She had not spoken it before. I think she had been too afraid to, the way you don't name a thing you are braced to lose. But her milk had come back and her strength, and one evening she looked down at him and told me he was called Samuel after her own father, and then she looked over at Nadie and did a thing I did not expect. She pointed at her son and said his name, Samuel, slow and clear. And then she pointed at Nadie's boy and lifted her eyebrows in a question. And Nadie understood and said the boy's name, the soft double note I could never quite hold. And the 2 mothers sat there and taught each other the names of their sons, back and forth, getting them wrong and laughing and getting them right. And I sat with my book and did not write anything, because some things you do not write down while they are happening. You just try to be worthy of having seen them. So that is where we were. Not 2 enemies and not 2 strangers, but something with no proper name. 2 mothers who had traded the names of their children, and one white drifter who loved them both by then more than he'd ever admit in daylight, and a scarred man who had held all our lives in his hands for 2 weeks and never once closed his fingers. And it was into the middle of that, into the fragile good thing we had all somehow built out of a wagon wreck and a bad August, that the soldiers came riding. Not what was safe, not what was easy, not what would let everyone tell themselves a comfortable story afterward. He wanted to know, from the one person there who stood with a foot in both worlds, what the right thing was, and he was going to try to do it, whatever it turned out to be, even if it cost his own people, even if it cost his own child's ease, because that was the kind of man he was, the kind my whole life had told me did not exist. I sat with him in the dark and I did not answer. I could not answer. Every answer I turned over had a child's life on the wrong side of it. And the fire burned down, and the 2 bobbies slept, and 2 mothers who had started as enemies slept near each other now under the same sky, and somewhere out in the dark the soldiers came on, and I sat there holding a question I did not know how to put down. What I finally said to him, and what it cost, and what happened when the camp broke and ran, and which mother ended up carrying which child through the hills, and the thing I did that I have never told a living soul. That is part 3, and I have to stand up and walk around now before I can write it. I told him the wrong thing. I want to start there with the failure, because I have had a long time to be honest and I mean to use it. That night in the dark, when Dahana laid the whole terrible arithmetic in front of me and asked me what was right, I gave him the coward's answer dressed up as the practical one. I told him, with my hands, with the few words we shared, with a diagram drawn in the dust between us, that the safest thing was to leave Ellen and her son behind for the soldiers to find. Deliver the white woman back to the white world. Let the camp run light and fast with only its own child to carry. It was, I told myself, the merciful arithmetic. Ellen would live. Samuel would live once the soldiers got them to a fort with cow's milk and a doctor. The camp would have its best chance. Everybody lives, clean, balanced, right. And Dahana looked at me for a long time in the dark, and then he shook his head slowly. And I have thought about that head shake for the rest of my life, because he had asked me what was right and I had told him what was safe, and he knew the difference even if I had let myself forget it. He pointed at Samuel sleeping. Then he pointed out at the dark, toward where the soldiers were. And then he did a thing with his hand, a chopping cut, and drew it across the dust diagram, and I understood with a cold that went all the way down what he was telling me. He was telling me that leaving Ellen and the baby for the soldiers was not clean at all, that the soldiers hunting them were not the sort who found a white woman in Apache country and gently concluded she had been rescued. They were the sort who found a white woman in Apache country and concluded she had been stolen, defiled, that a crime had been done, and who then rode into the hills to answer that crime on whoever they could catch. Leaving Ellen behind to be found would not save the camp. It would paint a target on it. It would hand the soldiers a story, captive white woman, savage captors, that would justify anything they chose to do when they caught up. My clean arithmetic was not clean. It was a match set to the very people who had saved all 3 of us. I had been so proud of my balanced answer, and it was, in fact, the most dangerous thing anyone could have done, because it was the answer that let me keep believing I was one of the good ones while doing the thing that got them killed. Dahana did not shame me for it. That is the other thing. He could have. He just wiped the dust diagram flat with his palm and started over, and this time he drew what he thought was right, and I sat there and watched a hunted man draw a plan whose whole aim was to make sure that everyone, his people and the strangers both, came out alive, and to spend the extra risk of that on himself. Here is what we did. I will tell it plainly because it does not need decorating. The camp broke before dawn, as it had to, and ran for the high country, but it did not leave Ellen and Samuel behind for the soldiers to find, and it did not drag them along at killing speed either. It did the third thing, the harder thing, the thing that had not fit in my cowardly arithmetic because it required somebody to take on danger they could have avoided. I would take Ellen and both, no. Let me tell it right because the exact shape matters. Nadie would not split the bobbies. That was decided before anything else, and it was decided by her, and nobody argued. 2 bobbies feeding at one breast, and both of them hers now in every way that her body understood, and she would not choose between them any more than she would cut off one of her own hands to save the other. So the plan built itself around that fact like water around a stone. Nadie and both infants and Ellen would travel with me, the white man whose face was a passport through the soldiers' country, down and out toward the settled land, slow, safe, at a nursing pace. And Dahana and a handful of the men would ride the other way, loud, leaving sign, drawing the hunt up into the high rocks after them and away from us. Do you understand what that means? Say it plainly to yourself. To keep 2 bobbies and 2 mothers and 1 undeserving drifter safe, the scarred man and his men made themselves the bait. They took the whole weight of the danger onto their own backs and rode off into it on purpose, so that a slow little party carrying a white woman and a half Apache milk-fed white baby and Nady's own son could walk out the easy way. He did not have to do that. Every part of it cost his people and spared mine. And he did it because I had asked him what was right and then failed to answer. And he had answered anyway, with his life as the ink. I tried to argue. In the gray before dawn, I tried, with everything I had, to make him let me draw off the soldiers instead, or to come with us. And he put his hand flat on my chest, over the heart, the same gesture the old root-handed man had made that first night. And he held it there, and he looked at me, and he did not have to say a word. I had been let into something. And the price of being let into it was that I now had to be worthy of it. I had to get the mothers and the children through, all the way through, and not lose my nerve, because he was buying that passage with his own hide, and I did not get to waste it. They rode off in the wrong direction on purpose. I watched them go. The last I saw of Dahana, he was looking back once, and then he faced front and put his heels to his horse and went to draw the hunt onto himself, and I never saw him again, and I do not know to this day whether he lived. I have told myself 100 stories about it. In most of them he lives. I keep those ones. The walkout took 6 days. I could fill a book with those 6 days, and maybe someday I will. But for now I will give you only what matters. 2 women who had begun as a killing and a dying, walking out of the wilderness together with their children, taking turns carrying, taking turns failing, holding each other up over the rough ground. Nady feeding both Bobbies at every halt, the fat serious boy and the pale insistent Samuel, one at each breast now, twins made not by birth but by circumstance and mercy. Ellen, whose own milk had come back, feeding Samuel too, so that between the 2 women the 2 Bobbies were never hungry, both children drinking from both mothers as the days went, until I could not have told you, and neither could they, whose milk was keeping whose child alive, which was, I have come to think, the entire point that the whole hard country had been trying to teach me. The nights were the part I remember clearest. We could risk only the smallest fire, and often none, and so the cold would come down and we would put the 2 Bobbies in the middle and build the grown bodies around them like a wall, Nady on one side and Ellen on the other, and me at their feet with a rifle across my knees, and the Bobbies would sleep in the warm pocket we made, and the 3 of us would keep each other's backs from the frost. There is a closeness that comes from sleeping like that, night after night, that has nothing to do with words and cannot be argued into being or argued away. By the 3rd night, Ellen and Nady slept with their hands linked over the sleeping children without either of them deciding to, the way you'd hold a rope over a drop. I lay awake and watched those 2 linked hands in the starlight, one pale, one brown. A month ago they'd have been called enemies by every authority in that country. And I understood that I was looking at the truest thing I would ever see, and that almost nobody would ever believe me, and that it did not matter whether they believed me because it was true anyway, out there in the dark, where the stories people tell in daylight had no jurisdiction. We talked those nights in the low way. I translated what I could between them, which was less than they managed on their own. Ellen learned the boy's name properly at last and could say it, and it delighted her boundlessly, and she would say it to make Nady smile when the walking got too hard. Nady learned to say Samuel, and they taught each other other things, the small freight of 2 women's lives, Ellen showing the tin of buttons she'd somehow kept, Nady showing the way she wove a certain grass into a cord that would not break. Trading. 2 mothers trading the small proofs of their lives across a fire, and the wall between their peoples lying in pieces on the ground where it had fallen, and none of us saying anything about it because to name a miracle is to risk it, and we needed it too much to risk it. On the 4th day we hit a soldier's patrol. I had been dreading it, and it came, and it was the worst hour of my life, and I will keep it short. I did the talking. A drifter, and I said it, God forgive me, because it was the story that kept everyone alive, my wife, and our children, and our servant, gesturing at Nady, and I hated every word as it left my mouth, because to make Nady a servant in that lie was to spit on everything she was, and she knew what I was doing, and she lowered her eyes and played the part to save us all. And I have never forgiven myself for the relief on the soldiers' faces when the story fit the shape of the world they already believed. They rode on. They were looking for a captive white woman and a savage band, and they found a white family with a quiet Indian servant, and it did not occur to a single one of them that the servant was the reason the white children were alive. They tipped their hats to Ellen. They did not look at Nady at all. That is the whole disease of it in one picture. They could not see the person who had saved everything, because their story had no place to put her, and so she was invisible to them even as she stood there holding two living children they had ridden out to avenge. When they were gone, Nady raised her eyes and looked at me, and I started to say I'm sorry, and she stopped me with a small motion of her hand. She understood. She had let me tell the lie because the lie was a wall between her children and the men with guns, and a wall is a wall whatever ugliness it is built from. But I saw it cost her, and I have carried that cost ever since, one more weight in a saddlebag that was getting heavy with weights I could not set down. On the 6th day we came out of the broken country into the settled land, and the thing we had all been walking toward the whole time finally had to be faced. That we had arrived, and arriving meant parting, and parting meant choosing. And the choice was the cruelest one of all, and it had been waiting for us at the end of the road the whole time. Ellen could not go where Nady was going, and Nady could not go where Ellen was going. Ellen had to rejoin the white world. She had people, a sister in a town 2 days on, a life to try to rebuild out of the wreck of the one that had crossed itself out of her Bible. And Nady had to turn back to her own people, to find them if they still lived, to carry the boy home to whatever home was left. The road forked, and the mothers had to fork with it, and the two bobbies who had drunk from both of them and slept in a heap together for 6 nights and become, in every way that a body knows, kinship, brothers. The two bobbies had to be divided between the two roads. There was never any question that Samuel went with Ellen and the boy went with Nady. It was not that kind of choice. Nobody was going to take a child from the mother who bore him. The cruelty was subtler and worse than that. The cruelty was that these two women, who had walked out of hell holding each other up, who had fed each other's children from their own bodies, who had become in 6 days something closer than most sisters ever get. These two women were going to walk away from each other in opposite directions across an open plain, and they were never going to see each other again, and they both knew it, and the world they were walking back into would spend the rest of their lives insisting the 6 days had never happened. That women like them were enemies, that milk did not make kinship, that the whole thing had been an aberration to be forgotten as fast as decently possible. They said goodbye at the fork. I stood back and let them have it. I could not have said anything anyway. My throat had closed. Ellen took Nady's face in both her hands, the same hands that had once clawed at her, and she pressed her forehead to Nady's forehead and held it there, and the two bobbies fussed between them, and neither woman said anything because there was nothing to say in either language that was equal to it. And then Nady stepped back, and she did one last thing. She took the small smooth stone, the boy's stone, the treasured rock he'd offered Samuel across a blanket a lifetime ago, and she pressed it into the palm of Samuel's tiny hand and folded his fingers over it, so that the white child would carry into the white world one small proof, one stone from the hand of the boy who had been his brother, even if he never in his life understood what it was or where it came from. Then she turned and took the boy on her hip and walked back toward the broken country, and did not look behind her, because some partings you cannot survive if you look behind you. Ellen watched her go until she was a shape and then a speck and then nothing, and then Ellen turned to me with a face I have never been able to describe, and she said, "How do I live now, knowing what I know?" And I did not have an answer for her. I still don't. It is the hardest question this whole story ever asked, harder than what's right, and it was asked at the very end when there was no time left to answer it. How do you go back and live inside a lie, once a stranger's mercy has shown you it's a lie? How do you raise your son among people who would spit at the woman who saved him? How do you carry a truth that the whole world is organized to deny? I took Ellen and Samuel the 2 days to her sister's town. I saw them settled. And then, this is the thing I have never told a living soul, the thing I said I'd get to, I did not stay. I could have. Ellen asked me to. Her sister had a spare room and a widow's regard, and I think a life was being offered to me there. A soft, ordinary good life of the kind I'd never had. And I turned it down, and I have never fully known why, except that I could not sit at a supper table in that town and listen to those good church-going people say the things they said about Nady's people, the exact poison Ellen had spat 2 weeks before, and pass the potatoes and say nothing. I did not have Ellen's courage. She had to stay and raise her son inside that world and find some way to plant the truth in him without the world tearing it out. I only had to leave, which is the coward's version of courage, and I took it. I rode back out into the broken country. I told myself I was looking for the camp for Dahana to know if he'd lived. I never found them. Of course I never found them. People who are being hunted do not get found by a lone white rider blundering through their hills, and if I had found them I do not know what I would have done. I think the truth is I was not really looking for them. I think I was looking for the person I had been for 2 weeks in that camp, the one who stood over a baby with his hands open, the one who got told what was right by a scarred man and was, for a little while, worthy of the telling. I have spent a long time out here looking for that man. I catch sight of him sometimes, usually at dusk, near a low fire, with the smell of the country coming up cool off the ground the way it did that first evening. For a long stretch of years I was angry, and I could not have told you at what. Now I can. I was angry that the world went right on afterward exactly as it had been. I had walked out of the wilderness holding a truth that should have broken the world open like an egg, that the whole apparatus of who is savage and who is civilized was a lie, that I had watched 2 enemies become sisters over 6 nights, that the most Christian act I ever witnessed was performed by a woman the churches would have called a heathen. And I carried that truth back into the settlements expecting the world to fall to its knees, and the world yawned. The world passed the potatoes. The soldiers who tipped their hats to Ellen went on hunting Nady's people up in the rocks, and the newspapers went on printing the poison, and nothing I had seen counted for anything against the story. Everyone had already decided to keep believing because it was comfortable and it was profitable and it let them sleep. That is the cruelest thing I learned. A truth is not enough. You can witness the realest thing there is and carry it out on your own back and lay it down in front of people and they will step over it to get to their supper. I have made a kind of peace with that. The peace is this. It was still true. It is true right now, on this page, whether or not a single soul steps over it. Nady put a starving stranger's child to her breast in the dust with no thought of reward, and that happened, and no amount of the world's yawning can make it not have happened. I am old now. I have written this all down in the little book at last, all the parts, on more nights than I can count, and this is as close as I have ever gotten it to true. 3 lives changed forever, the title of the thing would say if it had a title, but I have come to think the number is wrong. It was not 3. It was Samuel, who is a grown man somewhere now and carries a small smooth stone he cannot explain a love for and does not know is his brother's. It was the boy, who is a grown man somewhere too if the hills let him grow, and who does not know he once had a pale twin. It was Ellen remade carrying her impossible truth. It was Nady who gave a stranger's child her body and her son's stone and kept only the loss. It was Dahana who answered the question I couldn't. And it was me, the fence man, the one who writes things down, who wrote out one bad August as one kind of person and never was that person again. 6 lives then. Maybe more. Mercy does not divide clean. It multiplies, and it keeps multiplying long after the merciful have walked away in opposite directions across an open plain and vanished into the country that was supposed to keep them enemies. I have kept the yellow cloth all these years. The curtain from the wagon, the one Ellen was carrying into an empty country because she still believed in a future. It is faded near to white now, and it has been folded so long it has worn through at the creases. I take it out sometimes. I do not know why I keep it. Yes, I do. I keep it because a hungry baby needed milk, and a woman with every reason in the world to turn away looked down into the dust instead, and did not. And the whole hard country was never the same, and neither was I. There is a last thing I could write here. I know how these are supposed to end, with the meaning laid out plain so nobody can miss it. But I have looked at the meaning a long time now, and I find I do not want to spell it out. I would rather leave it the way Nady left it, folded into a child's small fist, for someone down the years to open on their own and understand, or not in their own.